Well, Cindy already gave a pretty extensive background on why the NII exists and a lot of its history. And just to recap some of that, what I focus on primarily as my role is trying to facilitate the collaboration between researchers, anybody here who does any kind of neuroimaging. So it's not just things such as fMRI, it could also be things like any kind of structural imaging if you're using FreeSurfer, or diffusion-weighted imaging as well. Like I said, I work for the fMRI lab. I'm based in East Hall because if you were to draw a map of, I guess like where a lot of the traffic is for a lot of the people on Central Campus using it, it just was more efficient for me to be there. So my office is there, but I primarily do consulting for anybody who either is designing an experiment that they want to use in any of these modalities, or if they've already run an experiment and they want to get some advice about how to analyze it and possibly avoid any pitfalls. So my role, as I see it so far, has three main components to it. The first one is to find out which researchers around campus have expertise in different areas. Because I don't know it all, nobody does, but there are postdocs, there are researchers, there are graduate students who have expertise and a lot of experience in different areas. So this picture I'm showing right here, this is something called constrained spherical deconvolution. It's a relatively new diffusion weighting technique, which I only recently became familiar with. And I started talking to John Plass, who is a postdoc with David Brang's lab, and he has a lot of experience with this. He's done a lot of work with it. So I've been talking to him a lot because I want to popularize the knowledge and some of the methods that he has, as well as anybody else who has any other kind of knowledge about this technique or other diffusion weighting techniques. I thought I knew it all because I had a lot of experience with DTI, but apparently that's starting to become somewhat obsolete, and so we're trying to stay on the forefront and make sure everybody has the tools they need to stay current with those methods. A second part of my role, which Cindy alluded to, and which I find the most interesting part of the history of the NII, what got it kick-started, in my opinion, was this infamous cluster failure paper by Eklund and colleagues, which came out a couple of years ago. Now, it seems like something like this comes out almost on a schedule. Every few years, there's some paper that, prophesies Armageddon, and everything we've done is totally bogus, and it's a big deal. If nothing else, even after the initial shockwaves have worn off in the media, papers like these are very easy for reviewers to pick up on, right? So if nothing else, if they can't totally shred your paper for anything else, they can point to papers like this, or if you remember the voodoo correlation paper 10 years ago, it was Armageddon, everything was wrong. Okay, we survived that, but it became something that reviewers could use pretty consistently. So when something like this comes out, people may ask themselves, okay, how big of a problem is this? Is this a problem for me? And if it is a problem, what do I need to do to address it? So a large part of my time is going to be devoted to staying current with articles like this, making sure everybody's informed about, hey, is it a problem? If it is, what do you do about it so that you don't get burned? More than you already do by the reviewers. And lastly, again, as Cindy alluded to help create documentation and construct a kind of institutional memory that's available for everybody here. Now, one thing I like to do, I'll get to that in the next slide, but I'll be creating both videos, both online documentation that can be used not only by people here, but anybody across campus, and also anybody really who does neuroimaging, if it's available online. So let me unpack this a little bit and talk a little bit about my approach and my philosophy to how I'm going to be doing this. The first one is I like for people to be able to make educated choices. Now, what does that mean? It means that even if your lab has a very standard way of doing things, and all labs do, we all have some documentation that's been handed down, and it's more or less followed, and that's fine. because it can keep things consistent, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time there's a changeover in the personnel in the lab. However, when we're doing things like the fMRI course, or we're doing any of these fMRI symposiums, or we're doing any workshops, I like for the concepts to be very clear, and I like them to be directed towards the people who are going to be using them the most. For example, in a couple of weeks, we're having the fMRI symposium. And if you stick around long enough, at the very end, me, Mike, and Bennett will be talking about QA checks for fMRI data in particular. And if you haven't already signed up, if there's not enough space, we would really encourage you to send the person from your lab who's going to be dealing with that the most. It could be a lab manager, it could be a particular graduate student. And we want to really develop some training tools which will make it clear why certain steps are done and what choices are available to you if you want to change certain parameters. Another major part of my approach is using animations to illustrate concepts. So in my experience, when we read papers about a new toolbox or new technique, it may sound really cool, but the implementation can be sometimes difficult to do. Now, usually what you'll see in these papers is, say, figure 1, figure 2, and then mentally you have to fill in the links about how you got from part 1 to part 2, right? And what I've tried to do, especially in the past couple of years with these training materials, is to make those links explicit, to really show what's going on to get from step 1 to step 2, and then show you either the code or the buttons you need to press to get between those two steps. And lastly, as you'll notice, I'm wearing a microphone. And this is also something relatively new for me, but I think it's important for me at least, to record, most of the talks and the workshops I present for a few reasons. One is convenience for scheduling. So if we find a date that doesn't work for everybody, it's not a huge deal, even if some people really wanted to attend it, because it will be uploaded later and it will be put on the NII website for ease of access later. On a personal note, for me, this helps me also track the progression of how I present things. I like to so I'm recording the screen as well as my voice right now, just to see how it flows, whether I'm speaking clearly enough, slowly enough, things like that, because I still struggle with that, and I hate listening to my voice, but sometimes I like to go back and see if there's things that I can improve. Okay, so let me give you one short example about these animations that I was talking about. And if you were at the DTI workshop I gave last month, you probably already saw this. These are two figures from a DTI review paper by O'Donnell back in 2012, showing conceptually what happens with diffusion and then how these tensors are fit to produce either low anisotropy or high anisotropy. Right, so if there's a lot of diffusion but it's constrained along a certain dimension, that's high anisotropy. If it's more spherical and unconstrained, that's going to be low anisotropy. So you can, if you think about it a lot, and it's a good exercise to do this, you can kind of see from point 1 to point 2. Obviously, there's also text in there to help guide your thinking as it goes. But here's a brief 1-minute animation that I showed during that DTI workshop as an example of how to try to make those links explicit. So if you imagine this tube as an axon, in each of these axons, we also have these water molecules which are randomly diffusing throughout the entire tube. And notice there are boundaries. They can't go outside of those orange lines. So if they're going to diffuse, they're going to be diffusing more along the length of the tube. And if we fit a tensor, this red circle, we expand it to the boundaries of that tube, and it's going to be elongated along the length of the tube. Now, when they say something like eigenvectors, all we're doing is trying to measure the direction in each of the 3 dimensions. The dotted circle is the 3rd dimension. And once we have those, we then can compute something called an eigenvalue, which is like a scalar of the eigenvector along each of those dimensions. This is slightly oversimplified, but it's by design just to get the basic concept down first before we do anything more sophisticated. And then lastly, I'll provide a brief summary about what we learned from that. So eigenvectors, direction of the diffusion, and eigenvalues representing the magnitude of the diffusion. and then how you can use these symbols we learned about to calculate a certain diffusion measure, such as mean diffusivity. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking not about me, but about you. So my assumptions about the psychiatry group in particular. And this is, but it's also pretty common across every group that I've come across. So my first assumption is that everybody here is going to analyze imaging data at some point. Is there anybody new here? Is this anybody's first year on campus? Okay, so everybody's been here a while. But there will be some new people. Sorry?
Yeah, a few people are good.
Oh, you're just being shy. Okay.
We're just shy.
Okay. That's fine. That's fine. We applaud that because we all started out somewhere. But at some point, if you haven't already, you will come across this imaging data, and sometimes it's not as glorious as you think it's going to be. There's a lot of slogging that has to be done there. And yeah, sometimes. I'm still looking for that time where I do a start to finish analysis with no errors. You know, it's kind of the dream,
Yeah.
the dream goal. It'll happen. It's happened.
Something.
Right, exactly. So that will happen at some point. You know, there's a very imaging-heavy campus. Obviously, it's like that at a lot of different institutions. But my second assumption is that most people here have imaging data that they haven't looked at yet. And that's okay. It's okay to admit that. Because what happens, I'll let you in on a little secret because I've helped write a few grants in my day, is you get to the budget and you find out that you have all your fMRI time accounted for, you have enough trials, enough power, you're good with that, you have all the setup stuff, but since you got to round up to the nearest, say, half hour, you go, oh, actually I have an extra 10 minutes. So let's throw on a DTI scan or a resting state scan. What are we going to do with it? Well, I don't know, but whatever. We'll just try to fill out the rest of the time. And that's okay. That's totally reasonable. You know, if you can do it and it's not going to negatively impact the rest of your experiment, that's totally fine. But what I've found, not just here again, this is pretty common, is that this data gets collected, but people don't really do anything with it. So one of my goals here is to kind of kick the tires and remove those log jams, because sometimes it can be hard to know exactly where to start. There's so many different toolboxes. It's hard to know, which ones are going to stick around, which ones are going to be supported. Really, where should you start? What are the best practices? And that's where the people on the NII, we're all going to try to help people. If we can't help you directly, we can point you to somebody who will. Another assumption about you, obviously, is that here, in particular, there are a lot of clinical applications for your research. And what that means in general for a lot of people is either they're dealing, say, with not normal, healthy adult brains, but maybe there might be some kind of lesions, some kind of population that is under the influence of medications, things like that. And also, especially with clinical populations, you deal a lot with motion artifacts. That's a huge problem. And what I've come to appreciate in the past year, I was giving a talk at BU earlier this year, Swati Kiran, who does aphasia research, and they do a lot of work with people who have strokes, which leads to language deficiencies. And the people at their lab pointed out, hey, we don't have documentation, really, that tells us what to do or what the appropriate steps are. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. Most of the documentation out there for AFNI, SPM, FSL Free Surfer is geared more towards the assumption that you're dealing with healthy adults, right? So this is a bit of an underserved population. So how do we deal with lesions or really excessive bad motion? Not just with, say, the pre-processing part of motion, but what are some things we can do, even inside or outside of the scanner to try to mitigate those things? And there are papers out there. People have been thinking about this, but as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a real systematic attempt to consolidate all of it. And for this group in particular, that would be very useful. So as we're doing this, as we're helping you all out, because I'm very big on creating online documentation available to everybody, as we find things that work, if we find certain pipelines, certain steps that seem to be really good, are very efficient, I would love to document those, make some tutorials, put them on the NIA website, and also have them available to anybody else around the world, really, who's doing any kind of, or running into those same difficulties. So my last assumptions about you is that with QA checks in particular, and this is leading into a plug for the fMRI Symposium, there are a lot of difficulties with knowing what the standards are, right? And it's difficult because standards do change, especially in something like resting state analysis. I'm serious, it seems like every year there's a new set of guidelines. Yeah, am I right? Yeah. So how do we stay current with that? How do we stay up to date without really revamping everything at a pace that's unsustainable? That's really a balancing act that we're trying to achieve here. So to try to address this, again, I highly encourage, if you haven't already, the Neuroimaging Symposium on September 21st, we will be talking about this. And we're not going to have enough time to cover everything, obviously, but it's going to be a first step. There are going to be other ones in the future. Yeah, talk is cheap, but we promise that we will have these in the future to build upon that and, again, to try to keep people current with the best practices. Okay, so lastly, how to get help. fMRI help. Okay. My office is in East Hall, 1265. That's the northeast corner of the building. And I've set aside these times specifically for office hours. So I try to keep those hours totally clear in case anybody wants to come to me with some question about either experimental design or data analysis. Now, that being said, you can still set up a time to meet with me outside of that. It just might be a little bit more difficult to schedule it, but still totally doable. That's totally fine. I have no problem with that. And part of the reason why I have some of my office hours on Tuesday is because Bennett and Mike are also going to be on Central Campus on Tuesdays. So if somehow you find yourself on Central Campus on a Tuesday and you require something that needs one or more of us, and I'll give you an example in a little bit why that happened, we're available at that time. So there was one student a couple weeks ago, Amelia, I forget her last name, but she was a student who had a question about running FSL analyses on Flux, the supercomputing cluster. And it was great that she could talk to me and Bennett at the same time because Bennett had the scripts and the expertise for how to run these things on Flux, and I could give her guidance on what she needed to change in FSL. So that was a case where it was very efficient for both of us to be there at the same time. So just keep that in mind. Tuesdays, all three of us are in the same building at the same time. And lastly, there are, again, as Cindy mentioned, many things going on. There are public events. I try to stay on a schedule of giving a workshop every 2-3 months at the latest about some topic. So I gave one about DTI analysis last month. In a few weeks, at actually one of Cindy's NII seminars, I'll be giving kind of the next step, some more advanced techniques in MR tricks, if you're interested in that. And lastly, Methods Hour, sometimes they do have some talks on neuroimaging methods. So again, this is on the NIA website. We try to keep all those current, so please go there if you need anything.
Now there will be this meeting as well.
And now there will be this meeting as well, yes. So you need to be very careful about what you say when I'm giving a talk, because I'll record it. And, I can edit. It really doesn't pick up anything outside of me. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.